This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. Before we begin with my new book adventure here, before we do that, real quick announcement. I know I don't update my pictures page all that much. It's only when I come across a new Freemasonic embed in the movies or cartoons or whatever. Well, I found another one. If you guys want to go check it out. It's right at the bottom. Scroll to the bottom of the pictures page on my website. Another one from Walt Disney. It's actually from a very early cartoon of Walt Disney, 1930s. Found a little Masonic phallic symbol in an ancient Walt Disney cartoon, if you want to go check that out. Okay, now, the next book that we are going to embark upon. What if I told you this? This book comes highly recommended from the legendary Visigoth. That should tell you all you need to know. It's on the Visigoths' all-time must-read list. If you go to the first episode of the e-zine that Visigoth put out, Visigoth at the bottom of his contributions to the e-zine, he included a brief list of things you need to read to understand the world. And some of them are books, some of them are essays, some of them are available online, like this one. This one explains why we are in captivity. It explains how serious Jesus was when Jesus said money is the love of money is the root of all evil. This book is by a man named David Astle, A-S-T-L-E. Be careful how you pronounce that, right? David Astle, or maybe it's Astle. I'm told he died recently in 2008 as a very old man. I don't know that he wrote anything else, but he was a very scholarly man. I can't find out much about him online, but this book is called The Babylonian Woe. From what I can ascertain in perusing it, it looks to be assiduously footnoted. This is going to be a very scholarly work along the lines of an Alexander Hislop's The Two Babylons. However, it's much shorter than The Two Babylons. Without footnotes, it is 88 pages. With footnotes, get this, with footnotes, it's 154 pages. That's how assiduously footnoted this work is. The Babylonian Woe by David Astle. It was written in 1975, apparently, from what I think I found online briefly. But it traces the origins of our present money system, which is the system that holds us in bondage to the present day, making bricks for Pharaoh, all the time diminishing the amounts of straw, our ration of straw that we're given to make the bricks for Pharaoh. This is it. This is it right here. From what I could cursorily ascertain, but I haven't read it yet. I'm going to read it as you hear it. Your first time will be my first time through this book. Here we go. I'm really looking forward to this. These are the kinds of books I really dig. Hard to find, obscure books which tell gigantically significant truths that are mostly hidden. Just like the last book I read by Peter Kershaw. Boy, is that book ever needed. That In Caesar's Grip book. Prior to that, we did Gustavus Myers, History of the Great American Fortunes. Prior to that, we did Maureen Heaton's The Impossible Dream. Prior to that, we did the two works from the early 19th century, the early 1800s, by American inventor Samuel Morse, where even in the early 1800s, this highly esteemed, brilliant, scholarly American, famous inventor, had traveled to Italy and was warning the United States that the papacy was trying to take over the United States, even in the early 1800s. And then they did, with the Civil War and all the so-called Civil War. Okay, here we go. The Babylonian Woe by David Astle. A study of the origin of certain banking practices and of their effect on the events of ancient history written in the light of the present day. Following quote is from Augustus Beck from the Public Economy of Athens from 1828. Quote, "The intellectual faculties, however, are not of themselves sufficient to produce external action. They require the aid of physical force, the direction and combination of which are wholly at the disposal of money, that mighty spring by which the total force of human energies is set in motion." Unquote. Forward. Following is from Ecclesiastes 8, verse 2. "For money has been the ruin of many and has misled the minds of kings." When I originally approached my study, as best as I might, dealing with the growth in pre-antiquity and antiquity of what is known as the international money power, and the particular derivative of the money creative activities of such international money power that might be defined as the life alternative factor, I did so with some diffidence. Perhaps I was overly conscious of what seemed to be the inadequateness of my preliminary training in these matters, and that in no way could I describe myself as deeply conversant with the languages of ancient times, or, in the case of Mesopotamia, their scripts. However, in my preliminary studies involving checking through the indices of a number of those standard books of reference dealing with the ancient civilizations, I soon found that any feelings of inferiority, insofar as the adequacy of my scholarship relative to my particular subject was concerned, were unwarranted, and that qualms in these respects were by no means justified. In almost all of such books of reference, except those that classified themselves as economic or monetary histories, was practically no clear approach to the subject of money and finance, or to those exchange systems that must have existed in order that the so-called civilizations might come to be. In the odd case where the translations of the texts might reveal some key clue, no more special emphasis was placed herein than might have been placed on the mention of a gold cup, a ring, a seal, or some exquisite piece of stonework. In Jastro's Assyria, there was no reference to money at all. In Breasted's History of Egypt, a volume of 600 pages or so, only brief mention of it on pages 97 and 98. In A History of Egypt by Sir William Flinders Petrie, in the records of Sir John Marshall and E.J.C. Mackay, in respect to the diggings at Mohenjo-Daro, and in the writings of Sir Charles Woolley and others on their findings from their studies of the exhumed archives of the city-states of ancient Mesopotamia, little enough information exists on the matters referred to above. In Christopher Dawson, who wrote widely on ancient times, particularly in the Age of the Gods, which dealt with most cultures until the commencement of that period known as antiquity, there is only one reference to money, casual, and not conveying much to the average reader. This reference is to be found on page 131. In King's History of Babylon, there was practically nothing on these matters. Thus, in almost all of the great works of the great archaeologists and scholars specializing in the ancient civilizations, there is a virtual silence on that all-important matter: the system of distribution of food surpluses and surpluses of all those items needed towards the maintenance of a good and continuing life, so far as were required by climate and custom. In all the writings of these great and practical scholars, the workings of that mighty engine which injects the unit of exchange amongst the peoples, and without which no civilization as we know it can come to be, is only indicated by a profound silence. Of the systems of exchanges, of the unit of exchange and its issue by private individuals, as distinct from its issue as by the authority of sovereign rule, on this all-important matter, governing in such totality the conditions of progression into the future of these peoples, not a word to speak of. While it is true that the average archaeologist, in being primarily concerned with the results of the forces that gave rise to the human accretions known as civilizations, has little enough time to meditate on these forces themselves, especially since so little evidence exists of what created them or of how they provided guidance to men in the earlier days, still the widespread character of this omission borders on the mystifying. Virtual failure to speculate on those most important matters of all. The structure of the machinery of the systems of exchanges which undoubtedly had given rise to the ancient city civilizations, and the true nature of the energy source by which such machinery was driven, whether by injections of money, as known this last 3,000 years or so, or by injections of an exchange medium, of which little significant evidence or memory remains, is cause for concern. The truth of the lines as quoted herein from Beck's Public Economy of Athens is immediately clear to all, and that the physical force underlying all civilizations must have been the system whereby surpluses were allocated to the people according to their place in the pyramid of life. What did I tell you guys? It's all pyramids, the whole thing. And to their need. Thus, when being controlled by the benevolent law of a dedicated ruler, maintaining at all times the true and natural order of life, it must not be supposed, therefore, that there is a lack of understanding of the importance of these matters, nor that there is any special conspiracy of silence, even though there might indeed be temptation to arrive at such a conclusion. Yeah, there might. Rather, it were better to accept things as they appear, and assume that these scholars merely present the fragments of fact as they unearth them, leaving speculation of the true significance of such fragments of fact in relation to the weft and warp of life, to those considered to be particularly specialized in the fields represented variously. In the case of money and finance, the scholars concerned would be classified as economic or monetary historians. Thus, little enough seems to be available on the subject of money and finance in ancient days, nor seems to exist examination of the significance of such money and finance relative to the progress about which so much has been written in modern times. Apart from that of Alexander Del Mar, who wrote in relatively recent days, and apart from that of the philosophers of antiquity, such as Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Zeno, etc., almost no speculation seems to be available from scholarly sources in regards to the unprejudiced philosophy of money in ancient times. On the all-important subject of the consequences of the creation and issuance of money by private persons, as opposed to its creation and issuance according to the will of a benevolent, instructed, and dedicated ruler, almost no speculation seems to exist in ancient or in modern times. Of those forces that sought throughout history to undermine any ruler who may have been firmly in the saddle because of his exercise of that prerogative, which is the foundation of the state power or God will, of which he is the living evincement, insomuch as he maintained firm control of the original issuance of money and its injection into circulation amongst the people as against state expenditures, almost nothing seems to be known. Very little information is available of the means those forces employed towards this purpose through injection into circulation amongst the peoples of silver and gold and of instruments indicating possession of the same. Practically no information seems to exist of the growth of private money creation in the days of the ancient city-states of Mesopotamia, of which, because of their records being preserved on fire-baked clay, more is known than of more recent civilizations. And the gap must necessarily be filled by a certain amount of speculation. Little is known of the beginnings of the fraudulent issuance by private persons of the unit of exchange, as in opposition to the law of the gods from whom kings in ancient times claimed to derive their divine origin. Nor is there any information on the significance of such practice relative to the continued stability of the natural order of life, in which obtained that system wherein the fount of all power was the God. Such power descending to man by way of king and priesthood, and directing him as he proceeded about his everyday affairs, content that God's in his heaven and all's right with the world. The use of tools of hardened iron in the mining industry about the beginning of the first millennium BC, together with a changed attitude towards slave labor, in which the slave, so far as mining was concerned, was assessed at cost per life, must have brought relatively a very flood of silver into the circulation of the cities of the Near East. Such flood of silver injected into the circulation largely by private business houses, who no doubt controlled the mines, however distant, especially after the institution of coinage, in which a piece of silver of known weight and fineness passed from hand to hand, must finally and forever have broken that control of exchanges previously exercised by the god of the city through priest, king, and priest. Thus, all priest-kings and priests came to forget that the foundations of the people given to them from on high towards the maintenance of the right living and tranquil procession through life of their peoples were the laws of distribution of surpluses as written on the scribe's tablet. Laws instituted by the God himself, each ordering a specified dispensation from the surpluses in his warehouses in the ziggurat to the holder of the tablet. They too fell into the error of believing that silver with value, created as a result of its being used as a balancing factor in international exchange, could become a perpetual storehouse of value. They themselves became consumed in the scramble for this gleaming metal, so conceding it, through its controllers, the power to set itself up in opposition to the law of the gods, to raise itself up in its own right, God in itself. In its exercise, the fiat of the internationally minded group of merchants or bullion brokers that arbitrarily dictated the exchange value of such silver, being in actuality determination internationally of the value of money, placed such groups controlling silver exchanges above and beyond local law and the law of the local god, and indeed conferred on them the power to influence kingly appointment. It made of them the servants of a one God, a God above all gods, thereby somewhat relegating the God whose order on the state warehouses, as inscribed on clay by scribe or priest, had been the law governing exchanges, to the place of their servant the instrument. So money is becoming God, and those who are in charge of the money, who get control of the money by first owning the mines, if I'm reading this correctly, those get to be your real kings, and they displace the real king, and the real king becomes a figurehead, and they appoint the money lords, the money kings, begin appointing kings. And what happens today when the Federal Reserve head supposedly is appointed by the president, but people with a real brain and eyes to see know that it's the other way around. It's the Fed and the Council on Foreign Relations that appoint the presidents, select the presidents for us to, quote-unquote, vote for. Okay, wrote Professor Rostovtsev, scholar and economic historian of renown, quote, "I have, however, kept before me as a guiding principle in this, as other historical works I have written, the maxim that the complexity of life should never be forgotten, and that no single feature should be regarded as basic and decisive," unquote. It is true that while no single feature in the progression of history might be regarded as basic and decisive, it is certain that neither money nor treasure will protect the weak and disarmed in the face of a brutal and determined conqueror, beyond whose successful achievements can be no decision more final. It is also certain that the money accumulation mania, injected by fame into the minds of the people as a replacement to their concern with those natural qualities endeavoring to color the current of human life through time, amongst which are numbered virtue, honor, and godliness, destroys equally as any other debilitating disease, and will surely and speedily drag any people down to degeneracy and decay. A great army could not be more efficient in its power of destruction. The main discussion of the Arthasastra of Kautilya, a Hindu classic instructing kings and rulers as to their proper conduct towards good government, was as to whether financial or military organization came, first of all, as the root of strength and power in any organized state. Clearly in that day, no less than in this day, financial organization preceded military organization. Therefore, there is not much point really in discussion of so obvious a fact and truth. While an effete people, though money, as it is known, is in their hands, soon give way to vigor, nevertheless vigor, without strict organization of its finances, which, while constituting strict organization of its labor, also enables it to create or to obtain by purchase from elsewhere the finest of weapons, will not much avail. Thus, and it has been demonstrated through history over and over again, it is clear that there is one feature basic and decisive in the progression of human life. Certainly during the latter years of which memory exists, that feature, particularly in relatively modern societies from the Bronze Age onwards, and during that period of the rapid perfection of the mass production of weapons, is monetary organization, and what precious metals are available for purposes of international exchange as against the purchase of those finest of weapons and essential materials of war only obtainable abroad, and as wages for the most skilled men at arms, from wherever obtainable, abroad or otherwise. And the following is from an ancient Egyptian poem. The gates of Egypt stand fast like Inmutet. They open not to the westerners. They open not to the easterners. They open not to the northerners. They open not to the southerners. They open not to the enemy who dwells within. Much of history as we know it is the record of civilizations to counter and evade destruction of themselves from without or within. Or is the record of their efforts to destroy other seemingly competing civilizations or peoples attacking them from without or within. War is as inevitable as is peace as the result of the exhaustion of war, and there are few peoples that escape. But wars of the last 3,000 years have not been relatively infrequent occurrences and have been an incessantly recurring evil. It is no chance that the growth of warfare into a very cancer eating into the vitals of mankind, and more particularly the white races, is parallel to the growth of that other cancer which is private and therefore irresponsible: money creation and emission. It seems that almost none of the scholars make any serious effort to throw light on the real meaning of this matter of private monetary emission and the disastrous effects that it has had and in finality will have towards the defining of the remaining period of time of man upon this earth as being brief and uncertain. Those strange decisions of kings signaling the opening of wars as frightful and disastrous to the European peoples, as the last two so-called world wars, decisions so abnegatory of self, but more than that, abnegatory of the best interests of the peoples they represented before God, far from being the directives of benevolent force, are the directives of a force which cannot but be described in any way but as being wholly malevolent. The great engine, which is the international control of monetary emission and regulation, driven as it was until recently by the catalytic fuel of gold alone, is now almost world-embracing in the scope of its operations. It seems there is no chance in the attitude of those its guides, nor any admission of the folly of their misuse of this God power which they direct towards the good of themselves and their friends. Their obsession, despite ruin for all looming on every horizon, seems to remain the same narrow vision of the day of their own world supremacy, wherein they will rule as absolute lords over all. Although by now it should be apparent to them, no less than to all thinking people, that if this madness concealed within the much talked about conception known as progress is not brought to a complete arrestment, nothing remains but an end wherein shall be silence and no song. For indeed there will be no singer, nor any to sing to. As it looks today, it may be the end for the Indo-European peoples, whose diligent labors made so much of this world of today. It may be the end, final and absolute for all men, for that matter. It may be the end for this our earth, our only place and home and hope in this awful endlessness of space and time. It should be more than apparent that in the relatively recent day when kingship and godship were one, so far as the simple souls were concerned, and the God and his viceroy on earth, the priest-king, were creators and controllers of the economic good, exchanges were created in order that the people might live a fuller life, and not so much to benefit any secret society or interlocked group standing aside from the main paths of mankind, but to benefit all who kneeled humbly before the Almighty, each fully in acceptance of himself as part of the God-wish, eternal and infinite. Each one in his time an integral unit, carefully placed in the pyramid of life itself. History over these last 3,000 years particularly has been largely the interweaving of both a witting and an unwitting distortion of the truth, with all the inevitable consequences which have been expected and now are but a little way ahead. Kings largely became the mouthpiece and sword arm of those semi-secret societies that controlled the material of money as its outward and visible symbols came to be restricted to gold, silver, and copper. The fiat of the God in heaven, which had been the decisive force behind that which brought about an equitable exchange, was replaced by the will of those classes controlling the undertones of civilization, leaders of the world of slave drivers, caravaneers, outcasts, and criminals generally, such as was to be discerned on the edges of the ancient city civilizations, and followed the trade routes between them. The instrument of this will was precious metal. That's fascinating. That's fascinating. So in the ancient times, if I'm reading this right, this erudite language I got to decipher. You guys might want to listen to this twice. I might have to listen to it again myself. But if I'm reading this right, he's saying, isn't it strange or ironic, the people who were in charge today, the secret societies, the money changers, it's a criminal class, and in ancient times, when kings and priests were in charge of the money, this money class, they were on the edges of society, and you would encounter them on the roads, on the trade routes. Fascinating. Like people who might ambush you, right? Or the Templars. Think of even the Templars, the first bankers. What might have been or not have been the scruples of them. They were on the fringes of society, though, on the trade routes, were they not? At least initially. Anyway. Back to the book. The instrument of this will was precious metal, whose supply was controlled by the leaders of these classes through their control of the slave trade, since mining was rarely profitable in the case of the precious metals, except with slave labor, even after the development of hardened iron tools and efficient methods of smelting. The power of these men, indifferent and alien to most cities as they were, relative to that power it was replacing, think of speculative Freemasons. They would travel from city to city. And then you get later on in history the speculative Freemasons who never worked with stone, but they were the money changers who, and other shysters and professionals who came into Masonry. Still, you're looking at an itinerant secret society which would travel from city to city. That's why the people, even in the top of our government, have no country loyalty, no national loyalty. Wow, this goes way back. You're talking about an itinerant class of Rich criminals. All right, super rich. The power of these men, indifferent and alien to most cities as they were, relative to that power it was replacing, which was the will of the benevolent God of the city, had been made absolute by sowing in the minds of men over the thousands of years the idea of such metals having a specially high value relative to other goods and services being offered for exchange. Indeed, that they were a veritable storehouse of value. The law of the ruler previously exercised towards the well-being of the people, in that they might live a good and honorable life, accordingly became corrupted. It became merely a symbol raised before their gaze in order that they might not look down and see the evil gnawing away at the roots of the tree of life itself, destroying all peace and goodness. Nor could these semi-secret groups of persons be seen, who so often were the sources of such evil, in their contemptuous indifference to the men of the state, who found meaningfulness and tranquility through life lived in natural order under the law of the king. They constituted hidden force deeply inimical to the best interests of mankind. Through stealthy issue of precious metal commodity money into circulation amongst the peoples, replacing that money which represented the fiat or will of the god of the city, and which was merely an order on the state warehouses through his scribes, this internationally minded group, from the secrecy of their chambers, were able to make a mockery of the faith and belief of simple people. The line of communication from God to man through priest-king and priest was cut, being replaced by their own twisted purposes, such as they were. I'm loving this book right now. I just have to decipher the erudite language. What I am picking up, I am loving. This gets right to the point. Right to the source. Not, however, guiding mankind into the heaven that could have been, and where all would be life and light and hope, but into such a hell as to escape from which men might gladly come to accept the idea of mass suicide. Wow. What a powerful way to end the foreword to the book. Oh, boy. Okay, we'll read part of, looks like we'll read a little bit of chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word. Every conclusion arrived at as a result of study of the fragments of information available in respect to money and its creators in the world of the ancient civilizations, long sentences, long erudite sentences, indicates the existence of a far-reaching conspiracy in respect to monetary issuance. Yeah, it does. Boy, this book is like the two Babylons. Just long, winding, erudite sentences. I don't mind them. I don't mind them at all. It's just it takes a little longer to get your head wrapped around them. Me at least, because I was public school educated. It's going to be a hindrance the rest of my life that I'm trying to overcome. But I appreciate people who are extremely educated, and I like reading their stuff and trying to get a little better at understanding and deciphering it. Okay, back to the book. In respect to monetary influence, influencing the progression of man's history in the earliest times of which written record exists. It is also outstandingly clear that this was the words cut out. It's something parent to that acknowledged and most obvious conspiracy such as exists today. The whole notion of the institution of precious metals by weight as common denominator of exchanges, internationally and nationally, cannot but have been disseminated by a conspiratorial organization fully aware of the extent of the power to which it would accede. Could it but maintain control over bullion supplies and the mining which brought them into being in the first place. Clearly such notion had originally come into being during that historically distant period when, first of all, free silver began to be extensively used as a convenient and highly portable commodity in settlement of balances outstanding in foreign trade. Certainly, as far back as Neolithic times. This fact was indicated by the evidence existing that values, and by inference money, were already expressed in terms of silver by weight at the time of the Azag-Bao dynasty at Kish in Mesopotamia, 3268 to 2897 BC, although in a sense perhaps narrow and strictly national. According to tablets unearthed recording a sale of land, the sellers were known as, quote, the eaters of the silver of the field, unquote. This expression clearly showed a connection between the conception of money as an abstract unit in circulation and silver, the tangible material on which the symbols of this money were later recorded. Such silver would then be valued according to the ancient customs of the international trade routes, which were manifested in the rules of the traveling merchants who controlled these routes. These rules being established towards the better regulation of exchanges between themselves. In other words, as a result of the establishment of the custom of settlement of balances in external trade by silver bullion by weight, it seems that a system of values had grown up in the cities of Mesopotamia. Over what period of time it would be impossible to say for sure. In terms of those accepted values of definite weights of silver bullion in such external trade relative to the staples of life, i.e. barley, dates, etc. That sales are recorded in the 4th millennium BC means that even at that time there was a clear conception of the significance of the abstract monetary unit, which is in itself an integral part of the law structure of any state. For such sales were in terms of money. The true meaning of such a concept being largely incomprehensible to most, even as in this day, except they were the truly initiated, those controlling the internal exchanges, namely the priesthood and scribes, might well be excused if they fell early into the error of expressing values in terms of the standard of values in international trade. This serious error brought about finally not only the collapse of that power through whose medium the god-kings were best able to serve their peoples, but also, as a further consequence, the collapse and fading of the meaning and benevolent purpose of the god-kings themselves. With silver bullion controlled by an international and conspiratorial-minded group, as indeed it is obvious it must have been, considering the main sources of silver supply as being far away from those centers of civilization whose money depended on it, and yet with people coming to equate money, in actuality the law of the ruler, with value according to the law created in the exchanges by the custom of the use of that same privately controlled commodity, then it becomes quite clear that scarcity or plenty in money, whatever way it was evinced in the circulation, depended on the manipulations internationally of that group controlling the distribution of precious metal bullion, and the plenty or scarcity they created as was convenient to them. If there was no silver, why then? There was no money, and prices fell. Substitute gold for silver, and history, seeming to fast repeat itself, we have the condition of the European world of the last 2,000 years. If there was no gold, why then again there was no money. Hence was able to develop that conspiracy against mankind, most exemplified by a continuous propaganda of hate against all authority, in pre-antiquity and antiquity, against the many city gods, and in relatively modern times, against the kings that rose out of the ruins of that which had been Rome. As those controlling totally the economic life of a state through monetary creation and emission, must have felt that kings and gods were more of a nuisance than anything else, the instigators of this conspiracy, in whatever place and era, obviously were those who first did the business of bankers, the controllers of values, and consequently the economic life of the states wherever precious metal was used. According to Sir Charles Woolley, excavator of the city of Ur in southern Mesopotamia, the unit of exchange in the days of the great city-states of Mesopotamia of the 3rd and 4th millennium BC, and which served therefore as common denominator of the value of goods and services, was the measure of barley, while, however, pointing out that gold and silver came to pass from hand to hand with a value dictated by their value with reference to the constant value of a measure of barley, he asserts that the salaries of government officials at the time of Hammurabi, about the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, were assessed in barley but paid in silver, such silver having neither stamp nor government guarantee. The notion, therefore, herein implied of the numerous officials and laborers of Hammurabi of Babylon waiting in line to have silver cut off from the bullion bar and weighed as against pay for the day, or the week, or the month, as the case might have been, although offered with sincerity, patently is as erroneous as that conception of the everyday use in the exchanges of the Asrud in a similar way, in which the classical scholars and numismatists would have us believe, and which implied that the foreman and his laborers in ancient Rome of the days of the kings also waited in line after their day's labor, say, on the Circus Maximus, to have a fragment of copper cut off and weighed in order that their wives might be able to go to the market to purchase the evening meal. Clearly, the word silver in the texts means no more than the word plata in modern-day Spanish or argent in modern-day French. These words literally translate as silver, but as money, which they are most used to indicate. They may be anything from grimy, tattered paper note to a silver peso, or to the brass coin which may function as divisible thereof. Similarly, the word from the texts denoting silver may be safely said to have meant that which passed for money, perhaps exchangeable in the temple or the money shops for silver, but being in itself anything which circulated, denoting multiple or divisible of the unit of exchange, be it clay or wood or glass or paper or leather or stone. Thus, as was the case in Sumeria, indeed, long, long before the time of the great Hammurabi, once money had come to be more of an abstract unit of account, based for its value in desirable goods and services, on the barter power of a certain weight of silver bullion related to the constant value of barley. It was no major advance for those who benefited most from this conception, namely, the bullion brokers and their satellites, the money changers or barkers, to find a weak king and a corruptible priesthood who could be brought to lose sight of the total control of the city, which was the right of the God they served, and who might turn a blind eye to those other more sinister activities by which the power of the ziggurat was further undermined. Of those times, Dawson, in The Age of the Gods, remarks, quote, "Originally, the state and the temple corporations were the only bodies which possessed the necessary stability and resources for establishing widespread commercial relations. Temple servants were sent on distant missions, provided with letters of credit which enabled them to obtain supplies in other cities. Moreover, the temple was the bank of the community through which money could be lent at interest and advances made to the farmer on the security of his crop. Thus, in the course of the third millennium, there grew up in Mesopotamia a regular money economy based on precious metals as standards of exchange, which stimulated private wealth and enterprise and led to real capitalist development. The temple and the palace remained the centers of the economic life of the community, but by their side and under their shelter, there developed a many-sided activity which found expression in the guilds of the free craftsmen and the merchants, and the private enterprise of the individual capitalist," unquote. This information from Christopher Dawson, with the translation of the tablets before him, and every assistance, no doubt, from those students in that particular field, is most illuminating. But of the undertones of those highly significant years in man's period upon this earth, he seems to see little, or he just does not choose to speculate as to their nature. Principal amongst those undertones, and quite possibly the force that brought these changes about, may safely be assumed to be the secret and private expansion of the total money supply effected primarily by the issuance into circulation of false receipts for silver and other valuables, supposedly being held on deposit in thief-proof vaults or otherwise for safe custody. Such receipts would be accepted by merchants instead of the actual metal and would function as money, and would be an addition to the total money supply, though not understood as such by the rulers, who would thus easily be inveigled into lending their sanction to seemingly harmless practices, or at least into turning a blind eye, especially if priesthood and scribes so advised. With that growth of the conception of private wealth, which would automatically follow on the acceptance of the idea of buying and selling, or perhaps better put, preceded such idea of buying and selling as according to a silver standard internationally accepted, such involvement of priesthood and scribe would not be hard to achieve. According to Sir Charles Woolley, trade seemed to extend from the city of Ur, particularly during the so-called Third Dynasty, over the whole known world, which certainly reached as far afield as Europe, being carried on by means of letters of credit, bills of exchange, and quote-unquote promises to pay, i.e. checks, made out in terms of staple necessities, of life expressed in terms of silver, at valuation of barley, probably at a given season of the year. All right, I'll go ahead and read the rest of chapter 1, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to take a couple of minutes break here. I'll see you on the other side. Okay, we're back. Time for the rest of chapter 1 of The Babylonian Woe by David Assel. There also is no doubt that the merchant, as representative of the god of the city from which he journeyed, loaned money by which the customers were able to make their purchases, such money merely being an abstraction indicated by the figures on the clay tablet. In earlier days, being backed by the will force of the god of the city, and in later days, by the promises of silver issued by the one who, at the time, would be the equivalent of today's banker, and who, should such a need arise, such as would be occasioned by the temple withdrawing its sanction or permissiveness towards his activities, would be able to partially back his self-created abstract money, which was the reality of such promises, with actual silver. Thus the caravaneer, or traveling merchant, gave credit, whether his own or that of the merchant for whom he was agent. From the ziggurat itself, directly the dwelling place of the god, it functioned as a form of foreign aid similar to the foreign aid of today. Considering that the merchant in earlier times operated solely with the credit of the temple that raised him up, while the temple remained supreme, such foreign aid was instrument of state policy, maintaining the servility of lesser states, while at the same time maintaining the steady working capacity of the home manufacturers and contented people in consequence. The classes of the dominant power were content that the manufactories gave them daily labor, and the classes of the subordinate power were able to buy the luxuries they craved and the necessities they needed as against money deducted from the credits loaned by the dominant power. Repayment of these credits, as in today, was made by way of return shipment of raw materials such as were needed for the manufactories of the dominant state. That such raw materials were assessed in value as according to the international value of silver related to the national value of barley in the dominant state seems most likely. However, it is clear that with the growth of silver in circulation between private persons and between private persons and states, as now would become an inevitability, that which had been total economic control from the gods through his servants in the ziggurat was bypassed, and merchants were now able to deal privately using their own credit or powers of abstract money creation. They were also able, through their control of distant mining operations, to afflict a previously dedicated priesthood with thought of personal possession, and debauch the priesthood, give them a sense of greed, right on. And through the control of the manufacture of weapons in distant places, they were able to arm warlike peoples towards the destruction of whosoever they might choose. Can you say, hello, fabricated Cold War? Those merchants of whatever race they may have been, who voyaged to the cities of Sumeria from places as far distant as the great cities of the Indus Valley civilization, known today as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, as is clearly demonstrated by the Sumerian seals found at Mohenjo-Daro and the seals from Mohenjo-Daro found at Ur, and who were, without a doubt, one of the main sources of precious metal supply in Sumeria. Those merchants came to realize that they could actually create that which functioned as money with but the record incised by the stylus on the clay tablet promising metal or money. Hello, fiat money. Can you say money backed by nothing? Obviously, as a result of this discovery, which depended on the confidence they were able to create in the minds of the peoples of their integrity, provided they banded themselves together with an absolute secrecy that excluded all other than their proven and chosen brethren, they could replace the god of the city himself as the giver of all. If so be, they could institute a conception of a one God, their God, a special God of the world, a God above all gods, then not merely the city, be it Ur or Kish or Lachish or Uruk, but the world itself could be theirs, and all that was in it. A strange dream, one whose fulfillment they never really expected. Some evidence of the knowledge and previous existence of such practice of issuance of false receipts, as against supposed valuables on deposit for safekeeping, clearly exists in the law number 7 of the great Hammurabi, which same law was undoubtedly intended as a preventative to this sickness in society, which, even at that day, may very well have been the cancer that destroyed much that has been before. According to Professor Bright, the Code of Hammurabi was but a revision of 2 legal codes promulgated in Sumerian by Lipit Ishtar of Isin and in Akkadian by the king of Eshnumua during the period of the breakup of that power formerly wielded by the god at Ur, that is, at about the same time that Ur was sacked by the Elamites in 1950 BC. And Amorite and Elamite political power was established over northern and southern Mesopotamia. Both of these codes are well before the Code of Hammurabi, and are evidence of the latter being but a revision of law codes existing in the days of Ur-Nammu, or before Ur-Nammu, meaning that most outstanding ruler who reigned from 2278 BC to 2260 BC during the 3rd dynasty at Ur. The severity of the penalty and the placing of the law so high in the code leaves little doubt that it was directed against an evil that was by no means new, and, who knows, may have been one of the deep-seated causes of the invasions that devastated Ur, both from the Gutim, the Elamites, the Amorites, and the Hittites. For no doubt of old, just as today, money power was as busy arming the enemies of the people, amongst whom it sojourned, as that people themselves. This is why the American corporations, even during the Vietnam War, was supplying the Soviet Union. This is why. This proves what was documented and proved by Anthony Sutton in all of his writings. It was going on in ancient times. The bankers profit by loaning to both sides and manufacturing arms and weapons for both sides of any war that they foment so they can profit more. While the scholars do not appear to have paid any special attention to this particular law or to have attached to it any special significance, its true intent and purpose is clear to anyone conversant with the origins of private money issuance in modern times, as indicated by the familiar story of the goldsmith's multiple receipts. Quote, if a man buys silver or gold or slave girl, or ox or sheep or ass or anything else whatsoever from a free man's son, or a free man's slave, or has received them for safe custody without witness or contract, that man is a thief, he shall be put to death. Unquote. The requisite of witnesses and contract attesting to the true facts of valuables on deposit would to some extent obviate the danger of the goldsmiths, silversmiths, or traders involved in a transaction, creating receipts for valuables that did not exist, in safe custody or otherwise. It was equally possible in ancient times, as much as in modern times, to circulate such receipts as money lawfully instituted, provided a corrupted priesthood turned a blind eye to this practice and loaned their sanction thereto. Such fraudulent money, or in the misleading euphemism of a corrupted world, credit, would be equally effective in foreign markets as in the home markets, if not more so because of the greater danger of exposure of the criminal nature of this activity that would undoubtedly exist in the home market. The severity of the penalty required by this law number 7 of the Code of Hammurabi, exercised by a strong and dedicated ruler, would have been an absolute deterrent to such practice that since that time, and more especially in modern times, since the 16th century A.D., has become so indurated to a fixture. Its results are to be seen on every hand, not to speak of the final result, which, though not yet arrived, else this book would not be in existence, is clear. The laws of Hammurabi, king of Babylon, just the same as those more ancient codes of which they were revision, were directed towards the regulation of life of nobleman as well as freeman, merchant, or slave, and no special concessions were given to either of these stations of life, even if such stations in life were accepted as integral part of the structure of the state life. Euphemistic and misleading words such as businessman or financier had not yet, it seems, been planted in the vocabulary. By and large, the king still ruled in absolute, and his law, giving justice to all, was carved in stone and placed in the marketplace for the highest or the lowest to understand clearly the laws by which he must live. Merchants were unequivocally described as such, and law ruthlessly prescribed severe penalties for their corrupt conduct. They were kept in place as a caste, not of the highest order, and, it would appear, somewhat similar to the Hindu system, they served the priesthood and nobility and were conceded a place in life as an instrument whereby the people generally might have a better life. The Code of Hammurabi, revision of more ancient codes as it was, does not reveal any particular regard towards this caste of persons. However, as by the time of its promulgation, both private property and privately issued money seem to have been well established, it is to be assumed that the ignorant of noble caste or otherwise were already deferring to that magic known as money, in much the same manner as they did at all times through latter history, when faced with the necessity of compromise with private money creative power, whose activities had been permitted by foolish kings, and to whom such kings had even committed the finances of the realm. Such was most clearly illustrated during the last 400 years in England, perhaps more so than at any other time in recorded history. In the time of Hammurabi, king of Babylon, matters were by no means as desperate as they are today. Merchandising was by no means regarded as an end in itself, and a means whereby it was the right of ignoble men to proffer any corruption to the people, so long as it made, quote-unquote, profit for them, and, quote-unquote, interest for the so-called banker who supplied the original, quote-unquote, finances out of his secret and costless money-creative processes. Money lending and merchandising, as it is known, still had not come to be a means whereby man-hating and therefore corrupt secret societies might seek to overturn the tree of life itself by way of sowing the seeds of decay in that true and natural order of life which had been ordained from time immemorial. Private money creators and the merchants, their satellites, had at that time by no means arrived at that point when they might conspire to present complete defiance to the gods and their appointed, and as a small matter in the way of their business, installed jackasses or whatever might be in the places of the mighty, as too often was the case in the latter days. Oh boy, if you guys can decipher this, it's powerful. What I glean from it, it is powerful, and it gets right to the source. This is why we're in slavery. This is it. The bankers, the money powers of ancient times, planted seeds of corruption, overturned the entire tree of life. This is why we're in slavery and captivity in this world. This is why we're running around in debt. Everybody in debt and mortgages. This is why your wife's out at work. Your child's being watched by some government agent, preschool teacher. This is why. And everybody knows it's not right. Why are we having this harried, frenetic pace of life? This is why. We're not supposed to be living under usury, wage slavery, and fiat currency, living off of credit. It's not supposed to be. We're not supposed to have secret money lords as our main power behind the scenes. We're supposed to have God-appointed leaders, and that's all gone. That's all gone. I think probably the last time, maybe the only time that ever was under the Mosaic Code in ancient Israel, and that didn't last long either. Okay, that's it. That was part 1. That was the foreword and chapter 1 of The Babylonian Woe by David Assel. I'm Gordon Comstock. This has been the Ministry of Truth. Over and out. I'm told he died recently in 2008 as a very old man. I don't know that he wrote anything else, but he was a very scholarly man. I can't find out much about him online, but this book is called The Babylonian Woe. From what I can ascertain and just in perusing it, it looks to be assiduously footnoted. This is going to be a very scholarly work along the lines of an Alexander Hislop's the Two Babylons. However, it's much shorter than the Two Babylons. Without footnotes, it is 88 pages. With footnotes, get this, with footnotes, it's 154 pages. That's how assiduously footnoted this work is. The Babylonian Woe by David Assel. It was written in 1975, apparently, from what I think I found online briefly. But it traces the origins of our present money system, which is the system that holds us in bondage to the present day, making bricks for Pharaoh all the time, diminishing the amounts of straw, our ration of straw that we're given to make the bricks for Pharaoh. This is it. This is it right here. From what I could cursorily ascertain, but I haven't read it yet. I'm going to read it as you hear it. Your first time will be my first time through this book. Here we go. I'm really looking forward to this. These are the kinds of books I really dig. Hard to find, obscure books which tell gigantically significant truths that are mostly hidden. Just like the last book I read by Peter Kershaw. This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. Before we begin with my new book adventure here, before we do that, real quick announcement. I know I don't update my pictures page all that much. It's only when I come across a new Freemasonic embed in the movies or cartoons or whatever. Well, I found another one. If you guys want to go check it out. It's right at the bottom. Scroll to the bottom of the pictures page on my website. Another one from Walt Disney. It's actually from a very early cartoon of Walt Disney, 1930s. Found a little Masonic phallic symbol in an ancient Walt Disney cartoon, if you want to go check that out. Okay, now, the next book that we are going to embark upon. What if I told you this? This book comes highly recommended from the legendary Visigoth. That should tell you all you need to know. It's on the Visigoths' all-time must-read list. If you go to the first episode of the e-zine that Visigoth put out, Visigoth at the bottom of his contributions to the e-zine, he included a brief list of things you need to read to understand the world. And some of them are books, some of them are essays, some of them are available online, like this one. This one explains why we are in captivity. It explains how serious Jesus was when Jesus said money is the love of money is the root of all evil. This book is by a man named David Astle, A-S-T-L-E. Be careful how you pronounce that, right? David Astle, or maybe it's Astle. He dealing with the growth in pre-antiquity and antiquity of what is known as the international money power and the particular derivative of the money creative activities of such international money power that might be defined as the life alternative factor. I did so with some diffidence. Perhaps I was overly conscious of what seemed to be the inadequateness of my preliminary training in these matters, and that in no way could I describe myself as deeply conversant with the languages of ancient times, or, in the case of Mesopotamia, their scripts. However, in my preliminary studies involving checking through the indices of a number of those standard books of reference dealing with the ancient civilizations, I soon found that any feelings of inferiority, insofar as the adequacy of my scholarship relative to my particular subject was concerned, were unwarranted, and that qualms in these respects were by no means justified. In almost all of such books of reference, except those that classified themselves as economic or monetary histories, was practically no clear approach to the subject of money and finance, or to those exchange systems that must have existed in order that the so-called civilizations might come to be. In the odd case where the translations of the texts might reveal some key clue, no more special emphasis was placed herein than might have been placed on the mention of a gold cup, a ring, a seal, or some exquisite piece of stonework. In Jastro's Assyria, there was no reference to money at all. In Breasted's History of Egypt, a volume of 600 pages or so, only brief mention of it on pages 97 and 98. In A History of Egypt by Sir William Flinders Petrie, in the records of Sir John Marshall and E.J.C. Mackay, in respect to the diggings at Mohenjo-Daro, and in the writings of Sir Charles Woolley and others on their findings from their studies of the exhumed archives of the city-states of ancient Mesopotamia, little enough information exists on the matters referred to above. In Christopher Dawson, who wrote widely on ancient times, particularly in the Age of the Gods, which dealt with most cultures until the commencement of that period known as antiquity, there is only one reference to money, casual, and not conveying much to the average reader. This reference is to be found on page 131. In King's History of Babylon, there was practically nothing on these matters. Thus, in almost all of the great works of the great archaeologists and scholars specializing in the ancient civilizations, there is a virtual silence on that all-important matter. The system of distribution of food surpluses and surpluses of all those items needed towards the maintenance of a good and continuing life, so far as were required by climate and custom. In all the writings of these great and practical scholars, the working... Oh, yes, that book ever needed. That In Caesar's Grip book. Prior to that, we did Gustavus Myers, History of the Great American Fortunes. Prior to that, we did Maureen Heaton's The Impossible Dream. Prior to that, we did the two works from the early 19th century, the early 1800s, by American inventor Samuel Morse, where even in the early 1800s, this highly esteemed, brilliant, scholarly American, famous inventor, had traveled to Italy and was warning the United States that the papacy was trying to take over the United States, even in the early 1800s. And then they did, with the Civil War and all the so-called Civil War. Okay, here we go. The Babylonian Woe by David Assel. A study of the origin of certain banking practices and of their effect on the events of ancient history, written in the light of the present day. Following quote is from Augustus Beck from the Public Economy of Athens from 1828. Quote, "The intellectual faculties, however, are not of themselves sufficient to produce external action. They require the aid of physical force, the direction and combination of which are wholly at the disposal of money, that mighty spring by which the total force of human energies is set in motion." Unquote. Forward. Following is from Ecclesiastes 8, verse 2. "For money has been the ruin of many, and has misled the minds of kings." When I originally approached my study, as best as I might,